This is a WTOC original presentation.
It's time to move the flag from the Capitol grounds.
The removal of the Confederate battle flag from the South Carolina Capitol grounds has opened up a big can of worms. The question now, what other monuments are appropriate in the public square?
Sometimes you may even have to chip into the foundation to rebuild. I think that's where we are right now.
You need to free the future from the icy grip of the past.
Questionable decision by law enforcement led WTOC News to wonder what it's like to walk in a cop's shoes. We'll do that just ahead.
How long does it take for our brain to process the threat and react to that threat?
I'm leaving tomorrow, but damn if you're leaving tonight.
What really happened in the Mercer house the night that Jim Williams shot Danny Hansford? John Barry, author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, has his own thoughts.
I didn't have actual physical proof. I just knew. And I have to say, a lot of Jim's friends just knew.
All ahead on WTOC Prime. When pictures of accused murderer Dylan Roof emerged, brandishing the Confederate battle flag, it signaled a tipping point for South Carolina's elected leadership when they were finally able to put the flag issue behind them after more than a decade of uneasiness. But the flag has brought into question other monuments in the public square. What, if anything, should be done about those? When the Confederate battle flag was removed from the grounds of the South Carolina State Capitol, it was a relief to Alex Brown of Hilton Head Island.
What does the flag represent to you, the Confederate flag?
Well, to me personally, Mike, I'll be honest, the flag for a long time brought some fear more than anything else, you know, because growing up, you're taught what it stands for. You start to equivalent that with hate groups. So as a kid, I was always afraid when I saw the flag.
No fear for historian Stan Deaton, but he does believe that the flag's removal from public spaces is the beginning of the South asking itself a long, smoldering question.
Is it any longer necessary for us to memorialize what many people consider to have been the greatest internal threat the United States has ever faced? I think it's a legitimate discussion to have.
I think we're at a point now where we're moving forward, okay? You've got to tear down some walls every once in a while to rebuild, and sometimes you may even have to chip into the foundation to rebuild. I think that's where we are right now.
The debate is shifting now to a broader conversation that looks both deep into the past and far into the future. In Atlanta, the NAACP wants Stone Mountain cleansed of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Jefferson Davis. Deaton notes that the symbols of the Confederacy are unique in the land.
There is a long tradition in this country for doing this. After the American Revolution, things with royal names disappeared. There's a reason there's not a King and Queen Street in Savannah, but there is a President and a State Street. Statues of King George III came down all across this country. Why? Because Americans wanted to decide who they wanted to honor. They didn't think those names represented their values anymore, and I think that's a legitimate thing. I think it's something that has gone on always in this country. There's also something to be said for letting statues stay up and the people that they represent slip from our public memory. We don't even know who they are anymore.
Deaton doesn't support removing monuments to Confederate war heroes, nor does Brown, but...
Are there other symbols that you feel need to come down, or this is a huge first step, let's move forward?
Yes to the last part in terms of this being a huge step forward. The monuments, at least in my mind, you don't see people equating the monuments with hatred. You got these hate groups. They make videos. This is a way of them recruiting members. So the flag, at least in my mind, stands for a whole lot more than a monument, okay? Do we need to go back and make sure we hash out and teach the exact history when it comes to these monuments? Well, I think so.
To get to the point about their cast people in a favorable light, the statue for Dr. King in Washington, D.C., any statue of Dr. King is not going to have anything on there about the allegations of plagiarism or adultery that we know about from having studied his life. The statue to Thomas Jefferson in Washington doesn't say anything about Sally Hemings or the fact that he owned slaves. He's an apostle of liberty. That is the way that we choose to remember him, but that's an incomplete picture.
Joe Dawson has a dog in this fight, too. Dawson is a member of the Francis Bartow chapter of the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Dawson says monuments like this one to Bartow hold an important place in the history of the South.
Francis Bartow, in his day, was a man among men. You have to understand, in 1860, your state was your country. And he went to defend his state from invasion. Just like the rest of the Confederate soldiers did, they fought the most valiant fight known to man, and that was to defend their homes and families from an illegal and unconstitutional invasion of the South.
The Sons of Confederate Veterans do not concede that the Civil War was fought over slavery. They believe that money and the inherent tension between the industrial North and agricultural South were the true culprits.
The flag came down, but what are we going to put up? What story are we going to tell the next generation?
Just ahead, we conclude our monumental discussion with some suggestions to solve the dilemma. And later, we ask the question that Midnight carefully skirted.
Did Jim ever tell you that's what happened?
Not in so many words.
Dr. Stan Deaton rightly points out that monuments are not history, they are public art placed to honor, perhaps even to glorify a figure. But they are hardly a complete picture, and that's the problem we face when a community's sensibilities change. Stan Deaton was out in front of a move a couple of years ago to rename the Talmadge Bridge, an effort that ultimately failed, at least for now.
A lot of people in Savannah are uncomfortable with Eugene Talmadge's name on our bridge. Now, obviously, we're not going to take the bridge down. Taking one name off and putting another on is like repurposing a building. McDonald's moves out and Gap moves in. That bridge is going to be there. I think the question this community has asked and will ask again is Eugene Talmadge represent who we are as Georgians in 2015? As one of the most racist demagogue governors who ever ruled, do his values still represent who we are? We're not going to tear the bridge down because his name is on it, but we might put someone else's name on there, or we might not. And I don't think there's anything sacrosanct about that name or anybody else's name being on a building or on a structure that is going to remain even if the name is taken off. That to me is different than taking a monument or a statue down.
But in Atlanta, there used to be a statue of turn-of-the-century politician Tom Watson on the Capitol grounds. That monument has been moved to a park, ostensibly for renovations, but Deaton notes that Watson is not a hero as we understand the word today.
Is an incomplete picture of Tom Watson. He said he made his reputation in part because of things he said about Jews and African Americans that we would consider, and many people in his own day considered to be vile statements. But his popularity with poor, rural Georgians in part rested upon those things. It's not on the monument, but I think we could place something next to it that contextualized that rather than tear it down.
Alex Brown isn't in favor of removing any monuments, but he does insist on a more complete presentation of the story of the people that are memorialized.
You don't want our next generation to be oblivious to the fact of how these things came about, okay? And not just tell some of the story when it comes to history, but tell the entire story.
One island, one community, one Hilton Head.
Brown teamed with Hilton Head Island Mayor David Bennett earlier this year to create a movement to unify the people of the Low Country under the One Hilton Head banner.
And let's focus a little more on, again, the new monuments, what we're going to be standing for moving forward. The flag came down, but what are we going to put up? What story are we going to tell the next generation in terms of them coming together and loving one another? That's more important to me.
Deaton agrees that this mess may solve itself.
We're already seeing, I think this means less to younger people than it does to older people, and that's natural. I think as time goes on, there may come a day 50 years from now, 100 years from now, where the idea that we still need to define ourselves with an attachment to the Confederacy may be gone.
Up later, David Clue finds out what it's like to be a cop in a sticky situation.
Put your hands above your head. There's an alarm going.
But just ahead, Dawn Baker has the story of a local woman proud that she's descended from slaves.
I thank God that his blood is in my veins.
Slavery is in the blood of America, and while that may be a shameful part of the country's past, that shame doesn't touch the people who were victims, the people who were enslaved. At least it doesn't for Estelle Mannion. Estelle Mannion shows off pictures of her family that date back to the early 1900s, but there are no pictures of the two she's most proud of today, her great-grandparents, Anderson and Tara White. We know they once lived here in Jasper County, South Carolina, in Cherry Hill. There is, however, a paper trail that documents their bravery and perseverance. Anderson White was a slave.
Sometimes it moves me almost to tears to see that I am here free and have such liberties now, and my grandfather was one who helped to pay the price for my freedom. It's overwhelming. It is, wow. This we read about. Anderson White lived in Charleston and had to walk to Ridgeland more than 70 miles to become a soldier and fight for our country. For a long time, blacks weren't allowed to fight in the Civil War until they thought they were losing. So I think he was a brave, brave soldier to have left a wife and 3 kids to go to fight for his country. Back then, blacks were considered almost less than livestock. But yet, he went and he served this country. White was buried here in Boland Hall in Ridgeland. His widow, Tara, had to fight the government for 6 long years before she got his small pension. Now, these are the papers the family found not long ago, archived at the Department of Interior in Washington, D.C., that document her fight to prove she and Anderson were actually married, and therefore she deserved the money. She was denied that $12 a month. And that $12 a month meant a lot. That fed them, that clothed them. It could not have been easy. She was a woman who persevered and who just didn't give up. Hundreds of years later, Anderson and Tara's struggle remain a source of pride and motivation for this family and generations to come. I can't imagine how hard it must have been. But I thank God that his blood is in my veins because it makes us survivors, people who are the best of the best of the best of the best, to have survived slavery, survived the war, to survive the hard times. It just makes me feel so proud, you know, that he gave something back to this country. So it makes me feel like, okay, Estelle, you got to do more. Estelle Mannion runs a successful advertising agency in Savannah.
Just put this beach here, put 10 feet of storm surge on the beach. The water's going way inland.
Up next, will you go if a hurricane bears down on the coast? The misery of Hurricane Floyd's evacuation has some worry that the public may not run from the water even if they should. And later, the first ever Meta book draws a huge crowd to downtown Savannah for the premiere. That's ahead.
Will you go? If a hurricane threatens the coast, will you evacuate? There's some concern that people who experience the nightmare of Hurricane Floyd exodus may not leave. Our discussion begins on Hilton Head Island.
So Tom, 48 hours before evacuation, and the biggest problem? That.
Just put this beach here, put 10 feet of storm surge on the beach. the water's going way inland. Storm surge is the key. Water is the key.
Tom Dunn is the emergency management coordinator for the town of Hilton Head Island.
About 36,000 people.
Just kind of looking at the landscape right here, there is no shelter. There's nowhere to go. I mean,
correct. We're the low country for a reason, because we're low.
People living on Hilton Head have several issues to tackle when a hurricane threatens. One is the evacuation nightmare of the single road, Highway 278, that connects the island to the mainland.
It's pretty obvious we have one way in and one way out off the island, so that creates a bottleneck. So that's the importance of people planning and preparing and leaving early.
To navigate the bottleneck, emergency management has devised a plan to distribute the traffic.
If you're leaving Hilton Head, obviously you have one way on, one way off. So you're going 278 all the way out to either 170. You'll go to 17 or 95,
okay,
depending on which lane you're in. And I think that's an important point. If you wait till a mandatory evacuation, you are put in a lane, and wherever that lane goes is where you go. So you don't get to choose where you go. So if you leave before, you get to choose where you go. If you wait, you don't get to choose.
Unlike Chatham County, which may evacuate only certain areas, all of Beaufort County will evacuate when the order is issued, and the order is mandatory. The decision on whether to evacuate takes on added complications for the islands around Savannah. A major thoroughfare for Wilmington, Tybee, Whitmarsh, and Tullahee is President Street, and it's currently undergoing a major overhaul.
So this is a canal right here. It's the Bilbo Canal, and basically all water from downtown ends up there.
There are actually two projects going on simultaneously on President Street. One is the widening and deepening of the Bilbo Canal to accommodate the water flowing and flooding downtown Savannah.
It'll be like 5 times as wide as it is right now, and deeper as well. So this is important because it's the very end of the line for this massive Bilbo drainage system.
The canal is 19th century infrastructure, no longer capable of handling 21st century population growth.
Yeah, this is where it all goes to.
But city engineers believe the real solution to President Street chronic flooding lies with dramatically changing the road itself.
The bigger solution for chronic flooding on our major hurricane evacuation route is just raising the elevation about 6 feet.
The project will take 2 years and span 2 hurricane seasons, and the biggest impact comes next year.
Of a massive lane shift, so the roadway that we see right now will be about 20 or 30 feet over here to the south. The lanes will become narrower, and they'll jog, and they'll be uneven. So traffic will be much slower, it'll be more compacted, it'll feel tighter, it'll be a bigger impact.
Fixing President Street has been talked about for over 30 years. Now that it's happening, people are concerned about disruptions and traffic snarls. But Bell says the time spent will pay off by freeing President Street from the grip of the Bilbo Canal, which operates on a system of metal gates that are hounded by problems. Now is a good time to download the WTOC weather app and make sure you're on top of hurricane progress and the traffic issues that go along with it.
It's a wonderful night in Harbor Town.
Just ahead, we'll take you to the most celebrated oak tree in the Low Country. It's center stage these days, and we'll feel what the police feel when they read a call.
How does the general public do?
Awful.
Greg Russell wrote the soundtrack for Hilton Head Island, played annually by CBS as part of their coverage of the RBC heritage. One of its phrases says, "There's nowhere I'd rather be than under these stars and this old tree." The old tree is known as the Liberty Oak, now enjoying its moment in the sun.
Say hi!
This is the most celebrated oak on Hilton Head, the Liberty Oak, made famous by Greg Russell's 39 years of performances and as the final resting place for Charles Frazier. Frazier was a Hinesville boy whose family was in the timber business, which led them to Hilton Head and the founding of Sea Pines. But Frazier wasn't just a businessman. He was also an environmentalist who fought hard to safeguard the natural beauty of Hilton Head, especially the live oaks scattered around Sea Pines.
He designated this 6 Oaks as a park in Sea Pines, a 24-acre park. He also protected the signature oak of Sea Pines, which is the Liberty Oak in Harbor Town, which was in the middle of his harbor. that he wanted to build. So if you look at the harbor, you'll see this protrusion coming out into this circular space, and he insisted on keeping that tree.
John Parsons is a landscape architect who retired to Sea Pines in 2008. He was drawn to the Oaks and set about to establish the Legacy Oaks program.
Throughout the entire area of Sea Pines, on our leisure trails, so that people on a bike could tour them. It takes about 3.5 hours to tour all of the trees, if you want to do it in one gulp.
For more information on the project, go to seapineslegacyoak.org. Here's an idea. Go tour the Legacy Oaks, then finish the afternoon with Greg Russell in Harbortown. Any night except Saturday, the rest of August. Just ahead, a look at the thought process of a police officer.
Anytime there's a pause or hesitation, it's going to cost you your life or somebody else's life.
And later, John Barrett.
They say, you know, the people here are not influenced by outside forces. I mean, they're not even aware of the outside world here.
It has not been a good year for the credibility of police officers across this country. Their decision-making has been questioned often and openly, from Ferguson, Missouri to Waller, Texas. In light of the increased public scrutiny, WTOC News went to the Georgia Public Safety Training Center to get a sense of an officer's perspective in the heat of the moment. It started in Ferguson, Missouri, where the actions of police officers triggered violence in the streets. It came to Augusta Avenue in Savannah, when residents questioned the shooting of a fugitive arrested for outstanding warrants.
Get out of the car! And then I will light you up. Get out!
Just this month, the actions of police officers in Waller, Texas, and the University of Cincinnati drew even more attention to police tactics.
We want to make the right decision. We don't want to shoot people that we don't want to use any force that's not necessary. Same scenario.
Major Harlan Prevost of the Georgia State Patrol and Metro Police Training Director Gary Taylor are responsible for making sure officers have the foundation they need to make the best decisions in the field.
Hello? Please? Sir?
To do that, they put officers in real-life scenarios to test their powers of observation and decision-making.
Ma'am, sir. Sir?
In this situation, WTOC's Tim Williams answers a call to an area that's had several armed robberies. That's all Tim knows.
Stop! Police, stop! Stop! Sir, stop! Stop! Sir, let me see your hands. Sir? Sir?
In spite of being ready, weapon aimed and steady, the suspect shot Tim first, an outcome that speaks to one of the principal dilemmas an officer faces.
How long does it take for our brain to process the threat and react to that threat?
Too long, I would assume, in the public state of mind, but for a trained officer, a little better.
If he's got a gun behind here, it takes him 0.58 seconds. That's just over a half a second. 0.58 seconds, pull that gun, shoot, and turn around and run. It takes us almost a second and a half to process that and react to it. For our mind to perceive, okay, there's a deadly threat, and now they can react.
Hold it right there, sir. I'm a police officer.
On this call, I'm responding to a burglar alarm in a dark warehouse.
Both hands. Put your hands above your head. There's an alarm going.
What's clear in the video, but not clear in what I saw, was that the suspect had pulled out a staple gun from behind the box. In hindsight, my actions might have been wrong, but the law on such actions is not based on hindsight.
Because your perception is the only perception that matters to the United States Supreme Court.
Right. Right.
What did you perceive to be the threat or not to be the threat? It's easy to second guess, and hindsight, is always 20/20.
How easy is it to define the guidelines that every police officer must follow before using deadly force? Is it as simple as it was in the 60s?
It's as simple as you can define reasonableness.
Okay, so reasonable is the key.
Reasonableness is the key, and it's hard to define.
The controlling legal principle is the Supreme Court's decision in Graham versus Connor, which leans heavily on the perceived threat to an officer.
We'll never apologize for our survival skills that we teach in the police academy. Because if you look back from the 70s to now, the number of officers being killed is less and less, and we attribute that to officer survival skills, and we'll never apologize for teaching officer survival skills.
Get your hand out of your pocket. Both hands out of your pocket.
Hesitation or tentative decision-making can get you killed. Major Prevost cites the example of South Carolina trooper Mark Coates.
You know why he was killed?
No.
He has hands in his pocket just like this, and when Mark Coates went to search him, he quickly pulled out a gun and shot the trooper from having his hands in his pocket. That's where he had his gun.
Mm-hmm.
Get that light out of my eyes, man.
Many of the scenarios involve people screaming obscenities at the top of their lungs.
That's what they're going to face on the street, so
We'll just
try to make it as realistic as possible.
If such language affects decision-making, it's better that it be discovered at the training center than on the street. In spite of intense public scrutiny of the actions of the police officer, Taylor says that use of force is in fact a rare phenomenon.
2008, nationwide, there was 40 million contacts between law enforcement and the community, okay? Think about that now, 40 million instances of contact between law enforcement personnel and members of the community. During those 40 million contacts during 2008, 776,000 of those contacts, some type of force was used or threatened to be used. That's comes out to what, 1.9%. The focus for us now is de-escalating these situations.
Right.
Of the hundreds of situations played out for police training, many do not involve the use of a weapon. That, say Taylor and Prevost, is because the first role of police is not force, and their best tool is not a pistol.
The most effective tool that they possess is their ability to speak and their ability to communicate and their ability to listen.
We want to thank the folks at Metro Police and the Georgia Training Center, and Julian Miller, who, by the way, just retired from the police department. He's the one who gave us access to tell this story.
Pale moon shining on the fields below.
Up next, the characters who fueled midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil have yet another incarnation that's just ahead.
21 years ago, a New York writer turned Savannah upside down by telling the world all of the hostess city's dirty little secrets. The city was at first aghast, but then as the tourist and tourism dollars poured in, we became gracious all over again. Now John Berendt has a new incarnation of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, a meta book. And while he was in town promoting that, we took the opportunity to ask him the question that hadn't been asked before.
He came racing back in the room, crazed, screaming out. His right arm was down by the side, and he said, "I'm leaving tomorrow, but God damn it, you're leaving tonight." And he took a pistol and pointed it dead at me. And if you never had that done,
That's how Jim Williams portrayed his deadly encounter with Danny Hansford on May 2nd, 1981. A position that he maintained through 4 trials until he was finally acquitted. John Berendt isn't so sure.
What do you think happened that night?
My own private opinion is that they got into an argument and Jim shot Danny. That's what happened, I think. And I always did. And why did I not say so? I did say so, but I didn't say so outright. I said so in a very subtle fashion. There are 2 places in the book where I make it very clear where I stand. When Jim dies of a heart attack at the end, I said he fell behind the desk in the very spot he would have fallen in if Danny Hansford had actually fired a gun, and the gun and the shots had found their mark. The other time is Minerva saying, well, Mr. Jim lied to me, he lied to the court, and he lied to me, and justice ain't been done yet. So the dead boy is working against him beyond the grave. I didn't come out and say he's guilty because, number 1, he was found innocent. You have to respect that. And number 2, I didn't have actual physical proof. I just knew. And I have to say, a lot of Jim's friends just knew. And you can talk to them today. But he died right after being acquitted. What does that say?
Berendt is the author of Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, the book that was the spark that lit Savannah's tourism fuse back in 1994. Midnight has sold more than 5 million copies worldwide. Perhaps more importantly, it was the rage of the literati and was featured in national media that reached tens of millions of eyes and ears. By the millions, those eyes and ears came to see what all the fuss was about in Savannah.
Pale moon shining on the fields below.
Berendt believes that was only fitting because the city herself was a main character.
How easy was it to make Savannah a character in the book? Which really is. It is. The city is a character.
It's a good question because it was easy as pie. Savannah is a character. And a lot of reviewers caught on to that. And they said, there's this man, there's the guy who has the poison, there's a man who shot somebody. But many reviewers said the main character of this book is Savannah. And that's right on. It is.
Can you appreciate the way that Savannah has changed in the years, not only since the book, but in a large part because of the book?
Yeah, I mean, it all has to do with tourism, I guess. People reading the book, wanting to see the place where it all happened, right. Having enjoyed the book, I suppose, and knowing that there's a magical city at the other end of this.
A packed house showed up at the Jepson Center recently to see Berendt in a rare public appearance.
My first introduction to Savannah was through the movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And now I live here.
We read the book, we saw the movie, now we can see the author.
As much as the city is a character in the book, so too is Berendt, a visitor to Savannah discovering her intriguing charms. Berendt says that the key element of his writing style was access to the workings of his players.
I sort of push myself onto people. And if you do it tactfully enough, politely enough, people will say finally, yeah, okay, sure, I'll talk. So it's a big effort to get inside. I had to do this in Venice, Italy, too, where it's doubly difficult because I had to master Italian and get inside and talk to people. But if a tourist goes to Savannah, they won't see the inside lives that I was able to get to unless they somehow get into people's homes. The same is true in Venice. You can take a Vaporetto down the Grand Canal and you can see the wonderful palaces, but you won't get inside unless you somehow arrange to do so. I take you inside. And they would say to me, why don't you come this afternoon? Come for drinks. Come at 4, we can start drinking earlier. So very often, by the time I was finished talking to somebody in their living room, they had several drinks. That's their doing. I didn't force anybody to drink, but this would happen on occasion.
Berendt's relationship with some of his characters is friendly, born of mutual admiration. But he is not friendly with everybody. Or rather, they're not friendly with him.
When's the last time you were in Mercer House?
I am not welcome in Mercer House. I'm not.
But his most lavish praise is reserved for the central figure in the book that made him rich.
I have to say, he was living at home the whole time I was here because he had been in jail for 2 years, then was released, and while I was researching my book and writing it, he was in Mercer House and available to me, and he was hilariously funny, very articulate, very bright, a fascinating person. So I would call on him many times, and he helped me with information about lots of stuff I was interested in here. So he was part of the atmosphere as well.
How lovely to see you out of bed.
Oh, Jim, I'd get out of bed for you anytime.
Less fascinating is his opinion of the movie made from his book, directed by Clint Eastwood with a star-studded cast who he thinks got it wrong.
You're leaving tonight.
In the new Midnight app, there are actual audio recordings that Berendt contrasts with Kevin Spacey's characterization.
You got any money left over? I'm on my last 20. Oh.
You can hear both voices. And you hear the real Jim Williams' voice for once, not Kevin Spacey's very skewed and off-center version of it. And you hear Danny Hansford.
Part of the reason for his disdain is an author's pride and need for control. From the beginning, Berendt insisted on being the sole person shaping the images created by Midnight.
The photos here might be the first time people are seeing them.
I didn't want photographs for the book. I didn't want to compete with photographs because photographs are, it's a moment frozen in time, and that moment might be the wrong moment. I mean, if it's a tragic character, you have a picture of somebody laughing. This is the tragic character. But with my words, I can portray the person. I can create a portrait that evolves through the story. Happy, sad, excited, or dead, or whatever. So it's much more to the point to have a verbal, a prose description that proceeds along the lines of the book and the plot and the atmosphere. As a snapshot can't do it.
Tonight, in this incredible city, we are announcing nothing short of the future of books.
When we come back, we'll take you to the premiere party for the new Meta book, a trendy evening with some of Savannah's most celebrated figures.
What an amazingly wonderful turnout, which I guess proves once again that Savannah loves a party.
In early March, the Midnight Metabook team brought their show to Savannah to debut what is being called the future of books. The Metabook, an iPhone app, includes the book itself, a dramatic reading, audio recordings including conversations between Jim Williams and Danny Hansford, and photos galore.
Jim tells me in one of the tapes about how he prepares for his Christmas parties. In another tape, he tells about how he met Jacqueline Onassis in his house, and those went right into the book. I might have edited what he said so that it fits on a page, but it's word for word. You might recognize some of the words that he tells me.
The app is a work in progress. It can be updated with new information, including a notice that no one at the Jepson Center wanted to hear.
So when there's a musical, you may wake up one day and find that there's a song on your Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil app. And eventually, I have to say it, I hope they'll include it, and I hope they'll treat me well, but eventually my obituary will be on it as well. Thank you. We'll end on a fun note, and that's it.
A little dark humor is to be expected from a man who immortalized many of the quirks and color of Savannah and brought millions of tourists to our town. That is this edition of WTOC Prime. Stay tuned for Elementary. Good night.